The flaw with GNUs is that they often don't have an opposition. Ask Zimbabwe. Formed a GNU in 2007, 2008, and now look at where Zimbabwe is at. If that body is the African National Congress, which is what's happening at the moment, everyone is going, let's go meet with the ANC, then you can appreciate that the manifesto that then is dominant is then the ANC's manifesto. And if that's what we think, then we must be clear. It's not a GNU, or it's not bringing together for an agenda for South Africa. It's the ANC asking people to help it stay in power. Let's call it that.
So Mmusi Maimane is actually raining even more fire and brimstone on President Ramaphosa and the ANC for what it seems to be describing as a scam in the search and the pursuit for the formation of the Government of National Unity, which the ANC is actually deliberating on as we speak. Let's listen to what he has to say and his complaint about the ANC's approach to forming the Government of National Unity, and I'll be back for some really interesting analysis on Mandela's idea and vision for the Government of National Unity in 1994 as compared to what is going on at the moment in South Africa.
Well, from what the ANC president told us last night, everyone's invited. Why the need to write to the Chief Justice?
First and foremost, I think we're putting the cart before the horse. What is the agenda of the people of South Africa? Now, there are a couple of things that we can take lead from. The first is the Constitution, and the institutions that come from the Constitution, and the objectives that are ascribed in that Constitution. So the ideals of saying you'll provide housing, you'll provide a job, you'll make sure that there's economic prosperity, that must be the framing issue. And then after that, once you've agreed on that timetable as to how you want to achieve those and proceed to govern towards those things, then only can you talk about a government of national unity. Talking about it before, at the invitation of the ANC, means that the agenda of the ANC is what's central to this issue.
Well, two things. One is that the conversations, as far as I understand, haven't gone there yet. The talks have been exploratory to see who's willing to come on board. And only thereafter will the teams, including the technical teams, then get into the detail, exactly the issues that you are talking about. And then secondly, there is, or seems to be, certainly among or from the Democratic Alliance, for example, an acceptance that the biggest party of them all should be given the right to decide whether, and if so with who, to get into some working arrangement with.
Well, then don't call it then a government of national unity. Then call it coalition talks amongst the ANC and its own partners. It's not a government of national unity. A government of national unity, if you want to take the 94 model, you must concede at that point that the ANC had nearly a two-thirds majority and therefore could invite whomever it wanted, and if the person left, then it wouldn't change the configuration of government. Other countries that do GNUs, for example, I can look at Kenya. It looks at the electoral results and then decide the leading party can then invite others, but there's a winner. In this instance, there is no outright majority. So any arrangement is a function of a grand coalition rather than calling it a government of national unity. If you actually want, and to your point, you say those things are technical, but they're actually fundamental.
No, I never said they're technical. I said the technical teams.
No, but what I'm
then,
I want to allude
the detail of that.
To the fact that in the absence of a clarion, here are the 10 things that actually we're setting up. All these preliminary talks that you are alluding to have fundamentally been about positions and how you add up the numbers to get over the line. And to me, I think that is the easy part of the conversation. Actually, I'm not going to say I will give you my numbers without actually ever knowing, will I endorse corruption? How will we fix ESCOM? How do we ensure Transnet is working? Those are fundamental. And then when we talk position, I can say actually the best minister of transport is actually from that party, or the best minister of education is from that party. That's a better conversation to have than if you want to have a structure that is not following the function. Create the function, and then you can work the structure from there.
But then, I mean, if you're looking at how many parties have made it to Parliament. Yours and, of course, those others that you wrote this letter with. That includes the ACDP, the ATM, the PAC, the UAT, and, excuse me, the UDM. All of you polled, fared fairly poorly in the election. Would you not accept that perhaps you can play a better role outside of those big parties that seem, or have expressed at least, a willingness to work together? Of course, some insisting that they can only do so without the others. You saw Floyd Shivambu, what he said just now. You had John Steenhuisen a day or two ago or so. Do you not feel that you'll perhaps play a better role outside?
I have maintained and will still maintain. The people who voted for Bossa said to me, Musi, go represent us in Parliament so that you can build one South Africa, you can fight for the issues we fight for. They never said, only do that when you're in government. They said, do that in Parliament. Parliament has an equal stance of all members. Furthermore, to this issue, I want us to be clear. The flaw with GNUs is that they often don't have an opposition. Ask Zimbabwe. Formed a GNU in 2007, 2008, and now look at where Zimbabwe is at. So yes, I agree. Let the big parties form the government. But if you choose to not opt into a GNU, do so not because you've got personality issues or you've got party issues. Do so because you say, this agenda is not the agenda that will serve 60 million people. And then furthermore say, I will play a very active role in opposition to make sure that government is held accountable, that government, if it does constructive things, I will endorse it.
Okay.
But if it doesn't, it must be held accountable. Because if we fail at that task, we are going to go into 5 years of people who have a sofa-slathane arrangement, if which after 5 years, the net consequence of it is that South Africa may not necessarily be better off.
Why then did you write to the Chief Justice? What is it exactly that you want?
We ask him to play a convening role so that the leaders that are going to Parliament can sit and discuss a plan. But it is really coming out of a spirit of saying, let's find the body that is tasked of preserving what sits as our national consensus at the moment, which is the Constitution, and go from there. If that body is the African National Congress, which is what's happening at the moment, everyone is going, let's go meet with the ANC, then you can appreciate that the manifesto that then is dominant is then the ANC's manifesto. And if that's what we think, then we must be clear. It's not a GNU, or it's not bringing together for an agenda for South Africa. It's the ANC asking people to help it stay in power. Let's call it that. I have no problem with that formation, but call it what it is, and not try and tell South Africa that this is somewhat a conceived plan by all South Africans so for its own future. My only interest in this conversation is 60 million South Africans. I'm not interested in any position. I'm interested in making sure that Parliament works, ensuring that South Africa's interests are put forward, and ultimately that our Constitution gives us guidance that in 5 years we could say we're living a better South Africa than we had up to now.
Yeah, so what do you guys think? Really interested, Musi Maimane speaks about, and he's really angry, and that it's strange also that he wants this Chief Justice to be the overseer for the negotiations for the government of national unity, and he points out these loopholes which the ANC seems to, be using to drive its, in his words, the ANC's own agenda for a government of national unity. So this might, according to Musi Maimane, is not a government of national unity as planned and as outlined by the governments, by the parties that make up the unity in itself, but it's a government of national unity that is driven according to an agenda by the ANC. So this is Musi Maimane's argument. But for this video, I thought that, I would like to analyze and go back to the analysis, because Musi Maimane speaks about how this GNU is different from the government of national unity during the time of Mandela and how it was formed in 1994 with the ANC and the National Party led by de Klerk at the time. But I found this really interesting research that describes the processes by which Nelson Mandela embarked on the negotiations for a government of national unity at the time in 1994, and I thought it would really be interesting for us to really understand and compare to understand Mmusi Maimane's complaints in light of the government of national unity that's been driven and pursued by the ANC at the moment. So it says here, and this research can be found on nelsonmandela.org. So it's nelsonmandela.org, and it speaks about the path to a government of national unity, okay? So it says that although it took a hard negotiation and intense debate for the ANC to accept the idea of a government of national unity as in 1994, something like that was envisaged earlier on. So in Mandela's treason trial, Mandela acknowledged a phased transition to democracy as something that would be contemplated. The possibility was there in broad and vague outline in the document Mandela sent to President P.W. Botha in 1989. So this document drew on insight, and I think I'm going to make a video where I'll be analyzing this document that Mandela sent to P.W. Botha, so we really understand the visions of Mandela at the time for the government of national unity. So it speaks about how this document drew on insight into the government's thinking gained from secret meetings with the government working group, on discussions with his fellow prisoners from Pollsmoor, and consultations with the ANC leadership in exile. The most crucial task, Mandela wrote, was reconciling the demand for majority rule in a unitary state with a concern of white South Africa over this demand, and as well as the insistence of whites on structural guarantees that majority rule will not mean domination of white minority by blacks. So reconciling these matters through negotiation was needed to break a deadlock, a situation in which neither side had the means to prevail by force of arms. So while the ANC saw the possibility of structural guarantees in a general and undefined way, the apartheid government, believing that it had enough power to prevent or at least delay majority rule, produced varied proposals for constitutional structures which would give minority groups, in particular whites, power beyond the numbers their political organizations could command. So it spoke about different manner of proposals that were issued from the National Party government negotiators, the Democratic Party, and the parties located in some Bantustans, okay? And from the mid-1970s, as resistance grew, a proliferation of constitutional models came from inside the country and outside, from defenders of apartheid and opponents who were nonetheless were not ready for democracy. So this included varieties of consociationalism, in which executive power is shared proportionally among segments of society defined along ethnic, religious, or linguistic lines, with a veto in the hand of minorities to protect their minority interests, and federations of regions as communities with a high degree of autonomy, and even different systems of governance in different parts of the country. What the schemes had in common was that they were incompatible with the majoritarian democracy. So, in other words, it argues here that, prior to even the formation of the Government of National Unity in 1994, there had been different models being cropped up by the different parties that would make up that government, different models of governance and all that, and probably that took a lot of time. But the challenge the ANC has now is that it has to form this GNU in a matter of 2 weeks, which is really difficult. So it's a complex position which President Cyril Ramaphosa has taken, either to probably corroborate what Mmusi Maimane argues, that the choice for a government of national unity wouldn't necessarily bring together, the ideas and the different models, or even have the time for these other parties to form their own models and ideas of what the government of national unity should entail, but that it actually calls them to kind of like be encapsulated within a framework of government of national unity that has been formed by the ANC government, So this is kind of like what Mmusi Maimane is complaining about, and this is how it differs from the government of national unity that was formed in 1994. So the research speaks about how, although the situation in 1994 was not static, nor were there expectations of the majority of South Africans and the international community, the Harare Declaration, adopted by the United Nations in December 1989, was explicit in its definition of the final outcomes of negotiations as an unqualified franchise that conferred equal rights on all South Africans. So the constitutional maneuvers were rendered stillborn by the work of the ANC, by the work the ANC had done to mobilize for consensus across the mass democratic movement on the fundamental aims of negotiations and to achieve acceptance of these broad principles across the globe. So it speaks about that further. The main protagonists in the negotiation process, the ANC and the National Party, were wary of the international mediation. So in other words, during the time for the government negotiation for the government of national unity, there was an international front that was actually mediating within in that whole process. And the ANC and the MP at the time were really wary about this. So both of them, the ANC and the MP and National Party, believe strongly that South Africa should resolve their own problems and find solutions that would, as far as possible, take into account the interests, aspirations, and apprehensions of their constituencies. This in part reflected a deep patriotism shared among South Africans, including the white community, especially among Afrikaners, as Mandela often commented. So it speaks about in the 4 years of Mandela's release and the unbanning of the liberation movement, the level of organization and mobilization among the black majority, the implications for all South Africans of a scorched earth, the negotiation acumen of the ANC and its allies, and the united voice of much of humanity, all these combined to whittle away proposals from the government side for structural guarantees in the form of group rights, power sharing, special majorities, minority vetoing, rotational presidency, and the like. And in the end, when the roadblocks had been removed, the compromise Mandela had foreseen took the form of a government of national unity as a transition mechanism towards democratic majority rule. So in other words, the government of national unity then, after the whole roadblocks and the whole proposals from all the other parties, when they brought out all their intentions on the table, the interests that they represented on the table, the government of national unity then became a compromise, okay? So it became a compromise which Mandela adopted, in other words, to represent a vehicle as the nation would move towards democratic rule. So the government of national unity wasn't a representative or representation of democracy for South Africa in itself, but it represented a vehicle through which democracy would be attained and achieved in South Africa. But in the case today, with what the ANC is doing, it appears that, the South Africa has actually already been described as a form of democracy, but a dictatorial democracy, one that is governed by just one party. But having a government of national unity in already what has been described as democracy in this regard seems to be different from what the situation was in 1994. And having the government of national unity now will really need to understand the visions. What is the objective of the government of national unity? What does it aim to achieve? Is it meant to achieve a better form of democracy for South Africa, or what is that? And remember that recently Floyd Shivambu of the EFF has actually argued that the EFF is not willing to take part in a government of national unity that would have these other vehicles of what he describes as the former apartheid, like in the likes of the DA and others that are drivers of, according to him, an apartheid-style governance model, but that, probably a different form of government of national unity would be what would be ascribed by the EFF, but not this one. Okay, so, but this is really interesting because according to Mandela now speaks about that a sensitive and provocative roadblock and a persistent one which continue to plague us. This is Mandela speaking now, which continued to plague us even during the period of government of national unity, was mainly a historic and psychological one, reflecting itself in endemic contempt with which the white community, especially the Afrikaners, had for the blacks, okay? For almost 3.5 centuries, a conservative and arrogant white minority had tried to apply the doctrine of Nazi Germany and preach the unscientific theory that blacks were inferior to whites, in fact that blacks were subhuman. One of the main architects of this theory, this is now Mandela speaking, one of the main architects of this theory was Dr. Hendrik Verwoerd, a former South African prime minister who held that blacks should not be allowed to venture into pastures where they were not allowed to graze. They should never be permitted to rise above the status of hewers of wood and drawers of water. The apartheid regime, even during the period of negotiations between the ANC and the apartheid regime, still believed that they could save white supremacy with black consent. Although the apartheid negotiators tried to be subtle, it was clear right from the start of the talks that the overriding idea was to prevent us from governing the country even if we won in a democratic election. I was still a prisoner in Victor Vesta when I met the President de Klerk, leader of the National Party, on 13th December 1989. Shortly before this meeting, I had read an article written by the editor of De Burger, then the official mouthpiece of the National Party, under the pen name of Dawi, in which he sharply criticized the concept of group rights, which was being peddled by that party as the best solution for the country's problems. So group rights meant that each population group, after the first democratic elections, would retain permanently the rights and privilege it had enjoyed before such elections, no matter which political party had won. The essence of this fiction, although not openly said, was that there should be no chance whatsoever in the economic and political system of the country. There should be no change whatsoever in the economic and political system of the country. White minority would continue to monopolize all the important rights of citizenship. Now, this is Mandela speaking. And he said that the revolutionary changes demanded by the liberation movement and for which martyrs across the centuries had paid the highest price would be stifled. The new government would be unable to provide shelter for the people and quality education for their children. Poverty, unemployment, hunger, illiteracy, and disease would be rampant, and De Burger criticized this pseudo-policy as introducing apartheid through the back door. So Mandela still speaking, he said, I pointed out to President de Klerk that if their own mouthpiece condemned this idea, he could well imagine what we thought of. We would reject it outhand. It was at this point that the president impressed me. He conceded that if our movement would not consider the idea, he would scrap it. I immediately sent a message to the ANC leadership in Zambia in which I described the president as a man of integrity with whom we could do business. I repeated this statement on countless occasions here and abroad after my release from prison. So Mandela still speaking, he says, from the ruins of group rights, there emerged another gimmick, that of power sharing. Broadly speaking, this meant that if, for example, the ANC won 75% of the votes in a general election and the National Party obtained only 25%, the ANC would not be able to take any major decisions without the consent of the National Party. Our delegation, under the leadership of Comrade Cyril Ramaphosa, uncompromisingly rejected this fiction. So we see that Cyril Ramaphosa has been around for quite a while, and he really has an understanding of this whole government of national unity. So Mandela speaking says, later, President de Klerk and I exchanged views on matter of the residence of Dr. Bill Venter, the then chief of industrial giant Altron. He says that, again, I urged the president to drop the idea, pointing out that we wanted nothing less than a true democratic government as understood by the civilized world. I warned him trying to sell us another version of racial discrimination was unacceptable, and worst of all, I said that would irreparably damage his credibility. I added that our delegation at the Kempton Park Negotiation Center and other delegates were engaged in advanced discussion on the government of national unity, which was a far superior principle than either of its two proposals. We finally agreed that this would be one of the best instruments for uniting our people. The government of national unity would include all the parties that won 5% or more of the votes in an election. Okay, so these are the kind of negotiations that went down, in the negotiations of government of national unity by 1994. And we see here that President Ramaphosa has been around for quite a while, and he understands these gimmicks and these issues, that might spring up in the government of national unity. And now that we have the official opposition, the DA, involved in the negotiations, and also the IFP and these other parties, along with the EFF now saying that, no, I don't want this, and the MK party is still yet to decide on where it stands. I think it's a really tricky place for the ANC government to be. And as Mmusi Maimane speaks about the fact that, All these parties have to bring their arguments to solve South Africa's crisis first to the table prior to forming a government, rather than forming a government that is built, the government of national unity that is built on an agenda of the ANC, and then kind of like still perpetuating the same repetitious cycle with which ANC leadership has actually, driven the country towards. So this is Mmusi Maimane's argument, and I don't know what do you guys think anyway? It has been a lot of information, but share your thoughts. What do you guys think about what Mmusi Maimane argues here in this video? Share your thoughts in the comments.